Welcome to DIY Tabletop. Today I'm going to be going over a game that I've made based on the EVE Online universe. It's a 1v1 card dueling game where you pit your frigate fit against your opponent's frigate fit and see who comes out on top. It plays between 30 and 45 minutes, made up of cards, hit point counters, dice, a couple of cubes, and it's just a really fun short game that I put together to try to bring some of the EVE universe out into the tabletop. I've also been working on a board game, more like a 4X space exploration one that I'll go over at some later point. Today I'm going to show you how to play it. That way those of you that found it on Tabletop Simulator can actually get through it and play a couple of games with your friends. So stay tuned and we'll get right to it. Okay, let's take a look at the different types of cards in the game. Here we have a frigate card. This is the Comet. It has 16 hit points, which are registered on this hit point counter. It has a capacitor pool of 10, and that looks like these little yellow cubes here. Recharges 3 capacitor per turn, so as you use them up, this one recharges at a rate of 3 per turn. The CPU is the fitting points a ship has available, so this one has 12 fitting points. And you can see on module cards, CPU cost is on the bottom here, so this one would use up 2 CPU out of the 12 available on the Comet. Then we have the speed. This one has a speed of 4 that can be increased with modules, and it can also be decreased by opponents' modules. The ship with the fastest speed is the one that gets to pick the range in the battle, and that can change throughout the game. Next we have the turret slots. So the high slot is this 3-prong icon here. This particular ship has 2 turret and 1 utility high slot, so we can fit 2 turret weapons and 1 utility module to the high slots. The next icon over is the mid slot. This one has 3 mid slots, and then we have 4 low slots. As you can see on the module cards, the slots indicated on the image here tell you where this card can sit. So this tank extender could either go into a mid slot or a low slot. Then we have the drones. So this Comet can actually carry 2 drones as part of its weapon setup. Here's a combat drone. You could fit 2 of these cards, adding 1 damage dice per drone. So that's your basic frigate card. Now we'll move on to weapons. So as we looked at, we have a combat drone here. It can only be fit to ships with the drone indicator on them. Adds 1 damage dice per drone. Its range is short, so this does count as a target while flying around the enemy, and the enemy would target it as a short range target. They have a speed of 8, which can be countered by stasis webifiers to slow them down and make them easier to hit. And this single drone is destroyed if hit 4 times in a turn, so that's 4 dice hits per shot. We also have other turrets here. We have a long range turret which adds 2 damage dice per turret. You can see that this one requires a turret high slot point to fit. At short range, that is over 4 speed, this loses 1 dice because of it being a long range turret. It doesn't do so well at short range or high speed targets. And then at long range, if your target is over 8 speed, it also loses a dice. So anything at long range at 7 or less gets max damage. Whereas the short range turret, this one adds 2 damage dice per turret, and then any ship that has short range turrets installed gains 1 additional damage die. This one is more effective at short range, but at short range over 7 speed, so if the enemy is traveling at 8, then it's going to lose 1 dice. And at long range, it loses 1 dice automatically per turret. Next we have the green cards. These are modules that must be activated by paying a capacitor cost. So 1 yellow cube to activate this tracking enhancer. Tracking enhancer, this one's going to fit in a low slot on our frigate, and the effect is that it increases your damage dice by 1 for every tracking enhancer fit to your ship. It costs 1 dice to use, so as we activate it, we put a capacitor die on there and turn it to show that it's been activated so that the opposing player can see what's activated against them. And this one has a capacitor cost, or a CPU cost of 2. Then we have passive modules. These do not require any capacitor to activate. Once they're fit to your ship, you get the bonus from them. This tank extender, as we mentioned, can fit in a mid slot or a low slot on our Comet. And the effect is that it increases hit points by 4. So looking at my Comet's base 16 hit points, I could increase this to 20 by adding 1 tank extender at a cost of 1 CPU slot. And finally we have the orange cards. These are rigs. Every frigate must have a rig, but can only have 1 rig. And they have a positive and a negative effect. So the positive effect is that it increases speed by 1. So that would take our base speed of 4, increase it to 5, but the drawback is that it reduces hit points by 5. Alright, now I'm going to show you how to fit up a frigate from start to finish. So the first thing we need to look at is CPU points. We have 12 fitting points, and as I mentioned earlier, each module may or may not have a number of CPU that it takes up. And then we got to keep in mind our high slot, mid slot, and low slot, as well as drone capabilities. So I'm going to start with the weapons and high slots. So we put the frigate in the center. Now I know that there's 2 drones available, so that's an easy choice there. So I'm going to take 2 of these combat drones, and we're just going to put them in the top row where the high slots go. Then I know that it has 2 turret slots as indicated on the card, so I've selected 2 long-range turrets. So they have the T for turret and high slot icon, and these each do 2 damage per gun, 2 dice per gun. So those are also going to go in the top row. Now keeping in mind, each of these has a CPU cost of 1. So that uses up 2 of my 12 available fitting points. And lastly, as we mentioned, we have 1 utility slot. So I'm going to select a utility item to go in the high slot. I chose the Energy Nosferatu. This one has a CPU cost of 2, and it does fit in a turret or a utility slot on the high side. So there we have 4 CPU used up of the available 12. Now we're going to look at the rig. I'm going to install a speed rig, so it increases the speed of the Comet by 1, and the drawback is it reduces hit points by 5. That's going to go on the left side of the frigate. Now we have mid slots. So the Comet has 3 mid slots. I'm going to start out by adding a weapon disruptor. This uses up 2 CPU, but it will reduce the opponent's damage dice by 1, so it reduces incoming damage, and you can see it goes on a mid slot. So that's one of my 3 mid slot cards. The next one is a capacitor battery. The effect is that it increases capacitor storage by 2 and a CPU cost of 1. So I'm going to put that right over here. That's a passive module. It's blue, so it doesn't require any capacitor cost to operate. And just remember, since that increases capacitor storage by 2, my capacitor is now able to hold 12 in the pool. And we have 1 mid slot left, so I'm going to use a tank extender. This is a passive module. Increases hit points by 4, and as you can see, It can be installed either on a mid slot or a low slot with a CPU cost of 1. So all your mid slots go to the right side of the Frigate. And low slots. So the Frigate has 4 low slots, but as you can see I've already used up quite a bit of CPU. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have 4 CPU remaining. So the first thing I'm going to put down is a low slot tracking enhancer. This increases your damage dice by 1 when you're shooting, and the CPU cost is 2. So that goes underneath, just like a low slot. Alright, so that leaves me with 2 CPU left on my Comet. Even though I have 4 low slots, I may not be able to fill all 4 slots because I'll run out of CPU first. So I'm going to install not 1, but 2 tank extenders. They can fit in either mid or low slots. They increase my hit points by 4 each, and they each have a CPU cost of 1. So there's the fit. If we tally up our CPU icons across the board, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, which matches the 12 CPU on the ship. I cannot fit any more items. There are cards in the deck that allow you to increase the CPU that you can fit onto your ship, but they do take up slots. Now I'm going to tally up the amount of hit points I have. So the Comet starts out with 16, but I have added 3 tank extenders, which would add 12 points, but then I also have a drawback on my speed rig, which reduces by 5, so I get 16 plus 7 additional hit points to bring me up to 23. So we're going to go to our hit point counter. So the Comet currently has 23 hit points available. The next thing I would do is select the appropriate number of capacitor cubes. So this ship starts out with 10 in the pool, but we did add a capacitor battery over here which increases it by 2, and I don't have any other drawbacks, so the capacitor pool would be 12 capacitor cubes to start out. Alright, let's talk about activating modules. So the green bordered modules are the ones that require a capacitor to be activated to get the benefits from them. So if we look at our player aid card for activating modules, you're first going to resolve all of your neutralizers and Nosferatu modules first, because they take capacitor from the opponent and sometimes give it to you, and then you can use that capacitor in the rest of your turn. So first we'll start out with the energy NOS that we have. So the effect on this is that it drains capacitor from the opponent and returns it to you. It cannot exceed capacitor storage. So even if I suck capacitor from the opponent, it cannot fill my pool past what my pool is allowed to have. So my capacitor pool on the Comet is 10 max, but we did increase that by 2 when we added the capacitor battery, so 12 is the maximum amount of capacitor I can hold at any one time. So to activate this, we have to pay a capacitor cost of 1, so I have to own at least 1 capacitor to activate this. So I'm going to pull 1 from my current 12 capacitor pool, turn it, and then ask the opponent for 2 capacitor. And I get 2 capacitor because at this point in the game we're going to surmise that we're at short range. Okay, maybe we'd be at long range, we might only get to pull 1 capacitor, but we're going to say we're at short. And if we look at the card, it says at short range you steal 2 capacitor, at long range you only steal 1. So we're going to steal 2 capacitor, so he gives me 2 capacitor. Now if I want to put these 2 in my pool, I have to make sure I'm not exceeding my maximum pool allowance. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, and 12. So 1 is wasted. I cannot fit over 12 capacitor in my frigate. Alright, now that we've resolved that, according to our player aid, we can now activate the rest of our active modules. So if I want to activate the weapon disruptor, costs 1 capacitor, and the effect is that it reduces opponent damage dice by 1. So I'm going to pull 1 capacitor from my pool, activate the card, and that will stay active through his turn. The next time he goes to shoot at me, he will reduce his damage dice by 1. And we keep the card tapped so that he can see that on his turn. And I'm also going to use a capacitor to activate this tracking enhancer, which essentially does the opposite. It increases my damage dice by 1 for the cost of 1 capacitor. So activate that, and when I roll damage against him, I will get an additional die. Once you're done with your turn and you've gone through all the shooting, you're going to recoup your capacitor based on the capacitor recharge rate. For the Comet, we have it set at 3, and I don't have any other modules that increase it further. You can fit modules that increase your recharge rate at the end of the turn. So at the end of the turn, you're going to discard all of the spent capacitor. So sometimes you might have 5, 6 different capacitor cubes out here. You'll pull them off of the cards and you can put them in a spent pile. Then you reference your frigate card, see what the recharge rate is, and then you'll pull that many capacitor back into your pool, not to exceed the total of 12 for this case. So I happen to be able to pull all 3 of these back and recount, make sure I don't have over 12. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So one of those 3 that I pulled back has to be discarded. You cannot exceed the 12 capacitor cubes for this frigate. And once that's done, you're going to leave your cards tapped. The opponent's going to play, and then when it comes back to your turn, the first step on the player aid is to untap all cards. So he's going to make his moves, keeping in mind that I have activated a weapon disruptor against him and reduces his damage dice by 1. Once it comes back to my turn, I start the turn by resetting all of my activated cards, and then we start again. So when talking about speed in the game, the basic concept is that the ship that is traveling the fastest at the current time is allowed to change the range at the beginning of their turn. So we have the range token here. If it's at short and you're the faster ship and you want to change it to long, then you can do so at the beginning of your turn, as indicated on the player aid, where you can either attempt a slingshot or change the range. So attempting a slingshot gives the slower of the 2 ships the ability to take a chance at flipping the range. So to do so, you spend 1 capacitor and you roll a single die, attempting to get a 1 or a 2, and if it's successful, then you can flip the range counter. If it's not successful, you've just spent a capacitor and you cannot change the range, so you have to stay where you're at, with the faster of the frigates outrunning you and determining the range to target. There's a couple of different ways to affect the speed of your frigate. So you have your base speed, as seen on your ship here. You can add a rig, which basically just gives you +1 to speed with a drawback. You can also add an active module called the Afterburner. It costs you 1 capacitor to use for 1 turn, and it increases your speed by 2. You can go further and be doubling your speed with a micro warp drive, but this has a disadvantage of requiring 3 capacitor per turn to operate, and it can be countered by an opponent's warp scrambler. So here's the warp scrambler. If the opponent has this fit and they activate it with the 1 capacitor, and they're at short range, they disable the opponent's micro-warp drive. And finally, you have a stasis web of fire, which reduces your target's speed by 50%. It is short range only, so get in close, activate it with the one capacitor, and then your target, regardless of what their speed is or what they have activated, will be set to 50% of that total number. So if we were flying against an Astero in this case, he has a speed of 5. We also have a speed of 5 because of our speed rig attached. Let's say this Astero has an afterburner attached, and these two numbers together, you got 5, 2, so he's going at a speed of 7, clearly faster than we are. If we're trying to keep our range long, and the Astero wants to get in close, he has the ability to flip that range counter to short. And as long as he is currently the fastest of the two frigates, he gets to keep that range counter wherever he wants it. Now if I can web him down or slow him down with the means of, any other device, and get his speed to be below mine, then I can flip the range counter at the beginning of my turn. If the speeds are identical, let's say the Astero is speed of 5 and I'm traveling at a speed of 5 and nothing else is affecting him, the range does not change. Now we're going to go over firing weapons. So firing weapons is relatively simple. First thing you're going to do is total up the dice, or the damage dice, on each of your weapons. So we have 2 of these long range turrets, and their default effect is that it adds 2 damage dice per turret. So I'm going to set aside 2 dice for the first one, 2 for the second one, and then we have these combat drones. I've got 2 of those, and they add 1 damage dice or die. I'm going to add another one for each drone. And we also have this tracking enhancer that we activated on the last turn, on this turn, which increases my damage dice by 1. So that would leave us with 7 dice starting out. Now, there's a couple of factors we have to take into account here. The distance to the target. So in this test, I have our range set to long. Okay, that could change throughout the game. So we're at long range from the target, and we're also firing at, say the opponent has a wolf, speed is 4. So if we look at our turrets, we're at long range, and the only time we lose 1 die is if we're at long range and the opponent's speed is greater than 8. The wolf is only traveling at 4, so we do not need to lose a die per turret. If he was traveling at high speed, or if the range was short and he was traveling greater than 4 speed, then you would lose 1 die for each turret, and you'd be down to 5. So once we've selected the appropriate amount of damage dice, we're going to roll, and any number that is 3 or higher counts as a hit. So I have 1, 2, 3 hits. So the opponent on their hit point tracker would take 3 hits. So if he's sitting at 7, he's now down to 4. And that is how you resolve combat. So game setup is really simple. Each player will start by selecting a frigate of their choice from the 8 available frigates. Now ideally you want to do this while not showing it to the other player, and you want to build your fit without the other player seeing it so they can't counter it with specific weapons. So if you need to set up a board in between the two as you set up and then remove it when the game starts, that's ideal. So once you've selected your frigate and your fit, make sure that you've tallied up your hit points based on what you have on the field. So we had our comet here, and we determined that with the 16 hit points that it starts with, and then the remaining ones that we added later that were up to 23 hit points. Also, select the proper amount of capacitor, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, and 12 was what we determined this Comet fit had, so make sure you have the proper amount of capacitor. Then from there, you're going to drop the range chip. This is the start of the game, so the range is going to be at random. So we flip it in the air, it lands on long, so the first round will be held at long range, and the player that goes first cannot change the range this turn. To determine first player, simply roll a dice for each player, and the higher number goes first. Player 1 gets a 6, player 2 gets a 2, so player 1 would go first here. And once again, they cannot change the range even if they are the fastest frigate, just for this first turn. Alright, now I'm going to go through a whole round of the turn sequence for one player, and this will just go back and forth between the two players. So we have a player aid card here. First step is to untap all cards. So any modules that are green that you had operated on the last one, you're going to reset those. Next step then is to attempt a slingshot or change the range if applicable. If I, in my Comet with a speed of 5, am faster than my opponent, let's say we're up against a wolf, speed of 4, I can then determine whether I want to be at long range or short range. So I pick long range. If I was the slower of the two, I could attempt a slingshot if I wanted to, spending one capacitor, rolling a dice, and trying to get a 1 or a 2, which would also allow me to change the range. The next step is to tap and resolve desired neutralizers or Nosferatus first, then tap other desired green cards. So if I was to activate this energy Nos, I would place a capacitor on it, tap it, get the capacitor back from the opponent that I stole from them, and then I could go on and pay for my other modules, activating them with whatever capacitor I have remaining. Then you'll determine the range and speed of the target, select appropriate number of dice, and roll for all weapons. So I have 2 dice for this one at long range, 2 dice for this one at long range, 1 die for each combat drone, and then an additional die for the tracking enhancer. And the opponent will not have any weapon disruptors against me this round, so I'm going to roll 7 dice, looking for 3 and higher as hits. 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 4 hits against this opponent, so they would take and reduce their hit points by 4. Then the final step here, or not final step, but have opponent remove a hit point for each 3 or higher. Did that. Final step is discard spent capacitor from modules and refill capacitor pool by referencing the capacitor recharge rate. So I'm discarding the capacitor that I spent, being sure I keep the cards tapped because the opponent may need that information on their round. This is spent capacitor, and then I know that my Comet recharges 3 per turn, so I can return 1, 2, and 3, not to exceed my maximum capacitor storage of 12. And that's the end of a turn. You go to the opposing player, they do the same thing, and it goes back and forth until one player runs out of hit points. I have 2 turret slots and 1 utility slot available.